Good morning, students. The lab is now up and running, and I would like you to watch this video in addition to the first part of the other video on tide gauges. Unfortunately, what happened is that NOAA changed their sea level rise viewer, so it doesn't perform now some of the functions that we used in the previous version of the lab. One of these functions was the vulnerability of communities to sea level rise. And the vulnerability is a function of race and income. And NOAA has unfortunately taken this off, which is a real shame. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to demonstrate the functions that you will need to use in the second part of the lab. And so what I'm going to do now is you can enter a search for an area. And let's look at Houston, Galveston, Texas. Okay, so I'm going to go to Galveston. And what I'm going to do is show you a few things now. First of all, down here is the slider for sea level rise. So you're going to need to use this. And I like to convert this to meters. So I slide this over. And why isn't it doing it? There we go. So this is in meters. So what you can do now is you can look at the flooding of coastal Texas as we raise sea level. So you can go up and you can see the blue coming in there. That's the flooding. So you can see it flooding over here. As you raise sea level, go up to 3 meters, basically the whole of Galveston Island and the whole of this marshy area on the mainland floods. So that's the first thing you need to do, is be able to play with this slider. That's the first thing. There are several questions that are based on how much sea level rises and what floods, and again, in meters. Okay, so that's the first thing you need to do. Please always use this search bar. When I mention different places in Miami and New York City in the graded lab, please always use this search bar to look for these places instead of searching forever. The other thing that you can do here, which I have you do in the lab, is to use the street view. So you click on this, whoops, not this, and not that, street view. So you can actually put on the street view, so you can actually look for street locations. And we can zoom in using this button here. So you can see detailed street views. And then, like, for example, if you raise sea level, you can see this area begin to flood. It's a really, really cool tool. I'm really glad they've preserved at least some of it for you to play with and hopefully use down the road. Because if you're looking to ever buy a beachfront property, for example, you can use the sea level rise viewer to see what happens to your property over the next few decades as sea level rises. Okay, so the second function we're going to look at here is these local scenarios. And this is what happens as we raise sea level under different emissions scenarios. So, okay, so I'll show you what you're going to be doing with this. So you click on one of these symbols here, and this is Galveston, Texas, okay, in the year 2050 in this case. But what I want you to do is view by scenario. So click on this view by scenario. And this gives you these different sort of emissions scenario, low emissions, meaning low sea level rise, to high emissions, meaning high sea level rise. Okay, so what we do here is we look at these scenarios, and we might want to just zoom in a little bit to this part of the island. Okay, so this is this location. And what happens is you go to the high emissions scenario, for example, and it shows you in 2020, it's going to be 0.19 meters. In 2100, it's going to be 2.5 meters. So to see what happens under the high emissions scenario, you're going to take the slider and go all the way up to here. And that's what happens under the high emissions scenario in 2100. You go 2.5. I can't quite get that slider at 2.5. It's not letting me do that. But anyway, you can see my point. At 2.5, in this case 2.6 meters of sea level rise, much of the island floods. If we go to the intermediate low emission scenario, then the 2100 would only be 1.05 meters of sea level rise, and only this tip of the island floods. So that is how to use the local scenario, and that's the second thing you will be doing in this lab, is the local scenario, okay? So just make sure that when I ask you what happens in the intermediate high scenario, for example, in 2080, you raise it to here, and you can see 1.4 meters of sea level rise, it's starting to flood. Okay? So that's the second thing. It's very straightforward, so long as you're comfortable with these controls. And there are questions in the practice lab which allow you to gain that comfort. Okay, then the third thing you're going to use is what we're looking at is high tide flooding, and that is today. Okay, these are parts of the coast which flood today at high tides. And remember, in this lab, in this module, we've been talking about king tides and high tide flooding in places like Miami and Charleston, South Carolina, and even New York City. So here we are in Galveston, and you can see in high tides, you have flooding in these areas, quite a lot of flooding in Galveston today at high tides, which is really, really important. So what I have you do in these questions is look at individual places and see which places flood at high tides today and which places don't flood at high tides today. Very straightforward. So again, you're going to be looking at sea level rise with the slider. You're going to be looking at these local scenarios where you click on a symbol or a symbol here. These are different locations in Galveston. And then the third thing you're going to be doing is looking at high tidal flooding. And you should be good to go with the second part of the lab. Again, make sure you watch that first video for the first part of the lab. And we will get this up and running. And let me know if you have any questions, and good luck.